Hatred itself becomes an exhausting, self-destructive pose. But this does not mean, on the other hand, that love comes easily. And that's from page 113 of Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. The genre is nonfiction, essay collection, short essays. It's around 179 pages. This is pretty much fast-paced, fast and medium, mostly fast-paced. And this is a book that I read to fulfill the prompt for my readathon. 8 books on Louis de Pointe du Lac's bookshelf, and the prompt is Louis is an outsider in his own community. So just to give you a little bit of a synopsis, this short story collection ranges in for various different critiques. It's broken up into 3 parts. Baldwin focuses on critiquing a protest novel, movies, African American experience abroad, relationship with his father, and a couple of other things. But the ones that I've mentioned so far are what I really want to focus in on. So as far as protesting or critiquing protest novels, Baldwin uses Uncle Tom's Cabin as an example and talks about its limitation. The protest novel broadly and specifically Tom's Cabin, as well as he goes on to critique white liberals and the assumption that the protest novel is all that needs to be done, and then people could just kind of wipe their hands away and can consider that there's nothing else to worry about. And in Uncle Tom's Cabin, he really focuses on how there's a character that's created and that's supposed to be representative of millions and millions of people. And it's just not possible for one person to represent all the nuances, all the complexity of not just a particular cultural community, but humanity at large, right? No one's perfect, but if we don't capture the messiness of humanity, of all our the good things and the bad and the ugly, then we're not really doing justice to humanity itself in a way. And so that just creates a false narrative, among other things like stereotypes. This is also something that he critiques of movies, the harmful racist archetypes that he was seeing being put out in movies. And so much of Baldwin's work focuses in on the African American experience in the United States. This is the first essay collection I think I read, excuse me, where he talks about being in Paris and that experience abroad. And so much of his work, although it does focus on America, this one is specific to France and his experience of feeling like he's a stranger, and also other people's focus on his exterior, not just initially, but for so much time. And I almost feel like he's saying it takes a while for people to accept his himself as a whole human being, all the parts of him. And so something else that he talks about is the jail system. He was arrested at some point, and that system in France is something that he speaks to. Something that I also found that I really liked was his conversation about his father, the strained relationship that he had. And there's actually, let's see if I can find the quote. About his complex relationship with his dad. There's so many different things. I'm wondering which one I should focus on. Okay, so he wrote on page 114, all of my father's texts and song, which I had decided were meaningless, were arranged before me, at his death like empty bottles waiting to hold the meaning which life would give them for me. This was his legacy. Nothing is ever escaped. And so much of his relationship with his father um, seemed to be at least emotionally contentious. And so it's only in death and this reflection that I think he starts to see his father in like a different light at times, which is really sad to realize was his experience. Something that also stood out to me when Baldwin speaks about being stereotyped in movies and in protest novels is Alicia Elliott's And Then She Fell. If you haven't read this book, I definitely think that the author Elliot is also having a conversation about that. Um, Elliot is an Indigenous woman, and she talks about being in an academic setting. Oh, I just want to tell you a little bit about her. It says Alicia Elliott is a Mohawk writer and editor living in Brantford, Ontario. And so, in this genre bending work, what she also speaks to is this character in the book is working to reconnect with their culture, but they're also married to someone that's in an academic setting. And so at times, this person that they're married to that's white, that is not indigenous, is correcting her on how to authentically represent her culture. And so it's just interesting the boxes that Baldwin is speaking to being put in Notes of a Native Son, which is really just to again create stereotypes, to dimensionalize a person, and also how harmful it is to try to or to tell someone how they need to portray who they are. So that was just really on my mind as I was reading Notes of a Native Son. And so I think I'll kind of leave it there because I have so many notes everywhere. All right, so why does Louis have this book on his bookshelf? Well, in season 2 of Interview the Vampire, Louis and Claudia are in Paris, France from 1946 to 1949. And we find this out in season 2, episode 2, when the real Rashid brings Daniel a box of photos. Well, Baldwin began staying in Paris, France in 1948, and he was in his 20s. So I would like to think that just maybe Louis de Pointe-du-Lac became acquainted with Baldwin, potentially in a cafe. They may not have been buddy-buddy because Louis can't really get close to humans, right? It always goes bad. But I would like to think at some point they were engaged in a conversation about art and other things. But so yeah, that's my little fantasy. What aspects of this book made me think of Louis? Well, considering Baldwin's conversation about his experience as a Black man in France, I was also thinking about season 2, episode 1, Louis and Claudia, when they were in Eastern Europe, and how, oh, what's her name? Just like the different interactions or like microaggressive experiences that they were having as they tried to navigate being in Eastern Europe. So that kind of stood out to me compared to what Baldwin is writing here. And also on page 178, I have so many markers. There is something that stood out to me. Where should I start reading this? Baldwin writes, I am terrified by the slippery, bottomless well to be found in the crypt, down which heretics were hurled to death by the obscene, inescapable gargoyles jutting out of the stone and seeming to say that God and the devil can never be divorced. I doubt that the villagers think of the devil when they face a cathedral because they have never been identified with the devil. But I must accept the status which myth, if nothing else, gives me in the West before I can hope to change the myth. And so that made me reflect on actually when Louis and Lestat, I think by the end of episode 1, was it? When Louis gets turned, I think Lestat and him have a conversation about the devil. And also later on in the narration, Louis does the same thing. And so I'm actually thinking about the past version of Louis that we go on a story with, and how other people treat him like an outsider, and what that must feel like not only to be an outsider, but then become a vampire, being this thing that you don't really know a lot about, and you have to navigate society being this other thing when society already treats you like the devil in a way. So I think that also connects to being seen as an outsider. But it's like this negative thing, right? So he's there's just layers of this concept of the devil that he's had to experience. And so I thought that kind of connected nicely, but then also made me reflect on Louis like on a deeper level as far as like his experiences. And there's one other thing that stood out to me. Did I bookmark it? Oh yeah. Something else I forgot to bring up. All right. So there's on page 103, Notes of a Native Son. This kind of reminded me of Louis. The moment I saw him, I knew why I had put off this visit so long. I had told my mother that I did not want to see him because I hated him. But this was not true. It was only that I had hated him, and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain. And again, that's from page 103, Notes of a Native Son. And so that also made me think about, or I've actually been thinking about Louis' like supposed hatred that he keeps saying he has for Lestat, and it's also mixed up in he has to hold on to that hatred because that hatred is mixed up in like denial and a lack of accountability, because once he lets that go, then he's going to really have to face his part of what happened in Paris. And so yeah, so that's basically what stood out to me in the book. There's one other thing I want to talk about, and I just realized if I talk about it now, it's so out of place from the discussion we're having, because he does have also a conversation about returning back to Harlem that I really enjoyed. So I'll say this about what he wrote. It's also Notes of a Native Son, page 100. He talks about Harlem being infected by waiting. I had never before known it to be so violently still. Racial tensions were exasperated. The situation in Harlem had grown bad enough for clergymen, policemen, educators, politicians, and social workers to assert in one breath that there was no crime wave, and to offer in the very next breath suggestions as to how to combat it. So that's something that just stood out to me. This idea of using people to scapegoat rather than focus on whatever the real problem is. And unfortunately, in the States, that cycle, it's like the oldest playbook in the colonial mindset structure is, instead of looking internally at what needs to be worked on, it's just easier to scapegoat people. That's also really harmful and dangerous. And we see that throughout history, throughout the beginning of the States. And now we see that kind of bubble up once again. And this always has connection to economic downturn. And so that really stood out to me. But that's something that Baldwin, he does observe. And I would say that's something that people talk about him the way that I think sometimes people talk about Octavia E. Butler, which is, oh, this person was prophetic. They saw what was going to happen in the future. I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think that they are noticing patterns from the past that then affected their present, and they saw those patterns continued. And you know what? The issues have not been resolved, and so those damaging cycles persist. And so I think that's what's really going on, and it's really unfortunate. But that's also why his work is, unfortunately, continues to be relevant. And it's like, we don't want it to be relevant anymore, but it still is. Also, now that I'm done with the book review and chatting about Louis, I did want to say, or just make a couple of suggestions. Stylistically, if you really love the Vampire Chronicles and you have not read anything by James Baldwin, so once again, if you stylistically like Anne Rice's writing, then please pick up Giovanni's Room. The writing in here, it kind of reminds me, it really does remind me of not just Interview the Vampire, the first book, but also The Vampire Lestat, and how season 2 of Interview the Vampire, the television show, was handled. So stylistically, this really stood out to me. If you're interested in reading a book that focuses more on, let's say, religious trauma, this is something that's also talked about in Anne Rice's work, or maybe more like the complexities of religion and philosophies and doubt. And that's something that's also dug into on the television show. Then you're going to want to read Go Tell It on the Mountain. This book is incredible. What really stood out to me was the imagery in this book. There's a way that he describes the people attending a church, just as far as like the imagery of what they're wearing, what's going on. And that really took me back to some childhood moments. But yeah, so you're going to want to check that. And lastly, if you were not enticed by Notes of a Native Son to pick it up, and you're more interested in reading books about the States and the racial and social injustices, there are 3 books that I have. So fictional, If Beale Street Could Talk. It's been made into a movie. The movie was incredible. I really liked the adaptation of it. And it's also really nice to reflect back on that movie because there are some familiar faces that I didn't realize the first time I watched it until I saw it the second time. That was pretty cool. There's also what he's so famous for, which is The Fire Next Time, which is a letter that he wrote to his nephew, about social injustice and racism in America. And lastly, this honestly is probably my favorite nonfiction, I don't know what you want to call it, essay, nonfiction by James Baldwin, and that is The Evidence of Things Not Seen. There's a lot that he is getting into, very specifically, very narrowly. And once if you read this first, you're going to notice all the points that he's making in all his other work. Yeah, so I definitely think that this is probably my favorite, if I could use that term, but it's talking about the Black administration in Atlanta and Wayne Williams. And this is in 1979 and 1981 when there was like a surge, right, of murdered children going on, um, and how that was all handled. So, yeah, if you stayed this long, because I went on a rambly tangent, thank you so much. Feel free to subscribe, hit the like button. If you read a different book other than the one I'm discussing to fill the prompt, please let me know. Let's have a discussion about that book or this book. And also, what was I going to say? Oh gosh, what was the last thing I got to say? Yeah, if you want to have a discussion about this book, I do have my read-alongs available. By the time this comes out, I think I'm probably going to close the one for this one. I opened it and I think I'm going to close it right away. The next book review that probably should be coming out is Living Through Birding. I think that's the next one. We'll see. I'm all over the place, but I blasted through this so quickly. I thought I'm going to get this review out on time. All right. Thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate you. I love you. And keep on reading. I'll talk to you later.